Hello all and welcome to ERPfixers webcast 2020 series. I'm Jess Carson, I'm your host. I'm with ERPfixers. Today is October 21st, 2020, and we will be presenting Universal Allocations and S4 HANA, presented by Paul Ovigele, our CEO. So before we get started, I want to talk about what is ERPfixers. We connect you with SAP experts to obtain quality immediate solutions for your SAP system. We consist of thousands of SAP freelancers globally in all SAP modules who are ready to help and assist with their knowledge in SAP. We offer an online platform, SAP Optimization Assessment, Material Ledger, S4 HANA Transitional Roadmap, and Cost Transparency Reports. If you'd like more information, please go to ERPfixers.com. So a little bit about Paul Ovigele. He has worked as an ERP financials consultant since 1997 in both North America and Europe. He specializes in implementing the FI and CO modules along with their integrated areas for companies in various industries. He speaks at numerous SAP conferences, offers strategic and functional level trainings to companies, and he is considered one of the leading experts on material ledger. He's the author of 100 Things You Should Know About Financial Accounting, Reconciling COPA to the General Ledger, Introducing the Material Ledger and S4 HANA, and Material Ledger and S4 HANA. So before we get started and I hand over the presentation for Paul, I just wanted to let you guys know that we will have a live Q&A at the end of this session. If you could please visit the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat box. Promptly click on the chat box, and there you can send us any questions that you have regarding this presentation, and which Paul will answer at the very end. Okay, Paul, I'm going to go ahead and give it over to you.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks for the introduction and welcoming everybody to this webcast. Hope everyone's doing well, staying safe and healthy. So as Jess said, this session is on Universal Allocation. I'll talk about what it is, and some of the topics we'll go through are the cost allocation challenges currently, the features of Universal Allocation, the simplification of it, the Fiori apps that are available with it, managing allocations, running allocations, and how it intersects with statistical key figures and managing global accounting hierarchies. So let's start with cost allocation and challenges. So currently in ECC, and the way I'll do this, I normally do this with my webcast or presentations. You know, I have the content on the slide. I will go through most of the content, or at least get the gist of the content on the slide, but also give you some kind of my experience or my take on the functionality we're talking about. So when we talk of cost allocation, in cost center accounting and overhead cost controlling, it's what enables business users to allocate amounts and quantities from a sender object to a receiver object. And typically what you have is actual data, plan data, which can be allocated from these sender cost objects. Cost objects are typically cost centers, internal orders, WBS elements, and then receiver cost objects in this allocation process, using what is called allocation cycles. Since I started SAP a couple of decades ago, you know, allocations has always been there. So it's not something new. It's always been there as assessments and distributions. I would say maybe 70 to 80% of companies I've worked with over the last couple of decades have actually used the allocation. Some companies don't, but most companies do. The two main types of cost allocations are distribution. So distribution is an allocation process where a primary cost is used to distribute from the sending cost object to the receiving cost object. So an example of that is if you have travel expenses in an account called maybe 6610000, and you're sending costs from, say, a shared cost center to a production cost center. In the production cost center, the receiving cost center, when you see that allocation, you'll see it with that account 610000. So distribution, whatever cost was originally occurred in the ascending cost center will be visible in the receiving cost center. For assessments, regardless of what cost is in the ascending cost center, and by the way, distribution, it's only primary costs you can use that you can distribute, not secondary costs. For assessments, you can distribute primary and secondary costs, and it doesn't use the original cost element, it uses a secondary cost element. So in my example, that account 610000, which was in the shared cost center, if allocated to a production cost center, the production cost center would not, you wouldn't see that account. You'd see a secondary cost element, something else that has a cost element category of 42. So it could be anything that you define. And just to touch on this, because every time I have an SAP implementation, when I do help a company implement allocations, I'm asked the question, we have to go through this discussion, which is, okay, which is better to use, assessments and distributions? I'm not going to go into that in detail here because it'll take us away from the core feature of this webcast, but there's not, both have their, are pretty useful ways of allocating. The question is, when you're looking at the receiving cost object, so in my example, the production cost center, does it matter if the allocated costs you're seeing tell you exactly what the cost in the originating cost center was? Or do you just want to know it's an allocation, what type of allocation it is? Was it a expense allocation, warehouse allocation, or do you actually want to know what's the primary cost, right? So that's really what it's about, granularity in the receiving cost object. So what are the challenges with the current structure? So this is a SAP slide, and some of you might even have seen this already if you've sat in presentations or webcasts from SAP, or even gone online to see it. So I'm not going to go into every single one, but I'll just touch on these four. Some of these challenges are understanding what the allocation process is. You have this template set up where it's not really visible to everybody, and even if it was, you don't really understand what it's doing. It takes a long time to run. It's pretty complex the way it is in the system, in the ECC system right now. Another thing is, if you're a budget owner or a cost center owner and you see costs in your cost center that have been allocated, it's not very easy to trace it back to its source, right? You don't know, how did this get here? What allocation factor was used to get it to my cost center? Now, some of these questions, even in ECC, you can get the answer. It's not, you're not totally blind to it, but it's just harder. You have to step through so many different rungs to get to the answer. Then the third thing is lack of simulation capabilities, right? So if certain things happen in your organization and you want to say, okay, if business structure changes, how will the allocation look like? What would it look like? Now, obviously difficult to have in ECC because in general, simulation ledgers or simulation capabilities don't really exist as standard in ECC. So it's hard to get any kind of simulation. So this universal allocation helps with that. I see simulation in two ways. There's a simulation that says, okay, once I've set up my allocation, and before I actually do the real run, I want to do a test run, right? That exists in ECC. But the simulation that says, okay, what if my organizational structure changes? How does it impact allocations? That is not available readily in standard ACC. And that's one thing Universal Allocation has because of its connection with the Universal Journal. Then also visualization. Now, this is a general issue with ECC is even though the data is there and if you know where to find it, you can. It's not very easily kind of visual for you to see to understand what you're looking at, or to see it in one screen. You have to click through many places, and even when you do, sometimes it's not very clear what the data is saying. So universal allocation also makes it this easier. So what are the features? So first of all, it combines various capabilities under one umbrella. You have modules like general ledger accounting, profit center accounting, cost center accounting, special ledger, joint venture, COPA, all these different things that in ECC had their own transactions, right? In fact, multiple transactions. I have another slide that points that out. They are all combined into this universal allocation. And for those of you who know the Universal Journal, you can see there's a theme here, right? There's a theme from having these disparate tables or processes all converging into one universal harmonized platform. So very similar theme. So SAP's, part of the innovation is on using the universal allocation, is on the usability of it, on the process itself, how flexible it is, and just giving you better insight. It is fully integrated with the Universal Journal. I think that's key. In order for universal allocation to work the way it does, it has to be, and I think what makes it work the way it does is because it is leveraging Universal Journal, which brings everything together, although it brings most things in FICO together. So it enables easier data reconciliation, smoother month-end processing, more efficient reporting. Currently out of scope is WBS and activity allocation. So activity allocations, for those of you who use it, it was called indirect activity allocation. So it looks just like an assessment cycle, and it's where you can allocate costs from one cost center to other cost objects, but using the activity using activity types as your sending tracing factor. So that's out of scope. Also out of scope is WBS. Now with I don't know. Okay, I'm not sure if you can even in ECC do allocations with a WBS. WBS is normally a settlement, right? Not an allocation. Same logic, but still different functionality. So I'm not sure if it existed in ECC. I can't remember because I normally do settlements, but regardless, it's not part of universal allocation yet. That's another thing to note about universal allocation is that it's still a work in progress. Actually, everything in S4 is a work in progress, but this is. So and what makes this more of a work in progress is that even though it's doing, and I'll tell you through this webcast, is doing things better than ECC, there are some things that are available in ECC that are not yet available in universal allocation. I'll mention some of those through this webcast. So for those who think, oh, this is it. I've been waiting for this. I'm going to kind of totally move over and just abandon the old process and go to universal allocation. You might find some things missing because it's still a work in progress. It started with I think it started either initially with 1809 or maybe maybe the cloud version 1902. It's much better in 1909. It's almost like I think 80% of what you'd need is in 1909. And in S4 2020, I think they've even made it, they've added some more features, but definitely, there's a roadmap of new features coming out. And so everything's not quite there yet. And I'll mention some of that during this webcast. So what are the features of universal allocation? So first of all, it's one architecture for accounting and controlling documents. I'll touch on this whole accounting and controlling thing. You'll find as the years go on, that kind of demarcation between accounting and controlling is going to diminish. In fact, even, you can already see that with the Universal Journal. You can see that with COPA being integrated. And more, it's not actually, doesn't seem to matter anymore, accounting and controlling. Everything is just Universal Journal. So if Universal Allocation sits on top of Universal Journal, that means everything in Universal Journal is available within, with some limitations with Universal Allocation. Actual and planned processes are included in the same application. So you don't have, like in ECC, you have one transaction for plan, you have one transaction for actual. these are in the same app, in the same processes. It's just a drop down if you want to do actual or plan. Currency breakdown is available. So again, with the Universal Journal, as you know, there are like now multiple currencies, you know, group currency, company code, these extra additional currencies. So as long as the currency is in that ledger for that company code, it's available. It's when you do your allocation, and if you look at the results, you'll see them in those currencies. Currency breakdown is available. Simulation capabilities before the actual run. Again, one could argue that that was already available with in ECC. If you do a test run, a little better with Universal Allocation because you can actually step into the allocation, the simulated allocation results. Process harmonization. So again, just bringing, you know, things that were previously separate all together in one or few apps. Top-down distribution for actual data. So top-down distribution, for those who don't know it, is just a way of, it's kind of an allocation within COPA. And COPA, by the way, is now margin analysis. So within the margin analysis module, if you posted something on a high level of characteristic, say a plant, right? So maybe you posted freight costs, but you only posted on plant level. But you do want to spread that freight cost to products within that plant. You'll do what's called top-down distribution, and it will allocate the freight cost based on some allocation criteria that you have specified, and it spreads it to every product within that plant with other filters if you want. So that's already available in ECC, but it was kind of sitting separately from allocations, right? But now it's part of this Universal Allocation. Includes actual and predictive data. So not just your actual ledger, your predictive ledger as well. It provides end-to-end traceability of the value flow. That was something definitely limited in ECC. Okay, you've done the allocation. Yes, you can see the results, but you don't have this holistic view of, okay, what went from where to where, or to how do I see kind of a picture, a visual picture of which cost centers were allocated to which other cost centers, and some even go in an iterative loop. So not very easy, although you can get to it in ECC, it's not very easy to see that just clearly and visually. It simplifies the process with guided procedures and validations. Now, this Universal Allocation is in Fiori, so it comes with a lot of the Fiori usability, user-friendliness, and intuitive navigation. And you have instant insights on costs related to GL accounts for the profit center or cost center. Let's talk about simplification of business operations. So in ECC, currently 24 allocation transactions from sections like general ledger accounting, cost center accounting, profit center accounting, COPA, joint venture accounting. Each of these different modules has its own suite of allocation transactions. And just to give you kind of a flavor of that, for those who either don't know or don't realize, in cost center accounting started the whole, like, at least when I started, there was only the main kind of assessments were cost center assessments, right? So if you take cost center assessments alone, so remember, assessments is the one where you allocate based on a secondary cost element. For cost center, you had actual assessments, and for actual assessments, you needed to create it with KSU1, change it KSU2, display KSU3, right? Execute KSU5. That's 4 transactions just for actual cost center assessment. Then you have planned cost center assessment, right? You create it with KSU7, change KSU8, display KSU9, execute KSUB. And that's just cost center, actual cost center plan. Then you also had distribution. This is where the allocation is with a primary cost element. So for cost center, you had the same thing, KSV1 to create, KSV2, KSV3, and then plan had the same thing, KSV7. This is like so many transactions for the same cost object, actual and plan, assessment versus distribution. And I've only just dealt with one of them. So you imagine you have same thing for cost center, same thing for profit center, same, well, not quite COPA, but joint venture accounting. And then when new GL came out, they brought this out, the new GL allocations. So that's why they're saying 24 allocation transactions for each of these. So this is 120 transactions. Actually, I think there's more, but let's go with 120. And but with universal allocation, the number of transactions now in Fiori, for those who don't use or don't know about Fiori, well, I'm sure you've heard about it, but for Fiori, instead of transactions, you have apps, right? An app is pretty much is equated to a transaction. So if you think in Fiori, there's 3 apps versus 120 transactions. That's because you can do so much in one app, right? So instead of branching to a different transaction within that same app, is just a drop down, whether it's cost center or profit center, or drop down whether it's assessment or distribution, or drop down whether it's plan or actual, right? So it makes it so much efficient, so much more unified. And it almost makes it like this one-stop shop. So you have these 3: manage allocation, run allocation, allocation flows. Allocation flows, I think, is a little newer. It's really allocation results. If you're in 1909, you'll see allocation results. I think allocation flows is for S4 2020, I think. There's a little more functionality. And by the way, speaking of which, I have to apologize because I was planning to do a demo today, but my 1909 system is down, so I don't have a demo, but I'll try to explain as much as possible. And I have some screenshots to show the functionality, and we'll take some questions, as Jess mentioned. Right, so this is another SAP slide. This is the business operations, so how these 120 transactions are kind of merged into just 3 apps, right? So it simplifies the process by combining these 120 transactions, right? Like I said, it uses the Universal Journal, the data from the Universal Journal. It's available in the Universal Journal, and one of those objects has been allocated, like the cost center. You'll get all the downstream data in your receiving cost object, and the postings will look in the Universal Journal just like, it's as granular as anything else in the Universal Journal. And I had already mentioned traceability of the value flows. Something else connected to this, apart from the allocations, there's also a new app, I think that came out 1809, I believe, for statistical key figures. Now, why is that connected? Because statistical key figures are tracing factors. It's an allocation factor you can use, like head count or number of employees. And so that has been enhanced as well. So it's not exactly the universal allocation, but you can use it you can use this app and even branch this app from universal allocation. Same thing with global accounting hierarchies, which is also a nicer, more uniform way of doing sets, financial statement versions, cost center, profit center groups, all that stuff. And for those of you who use allocations, you should know that within an allocation, you're normally using hierarchies for your senders and receivers. Those hierarchies will branch out into this new app. So global accounting hierarchies is a separate app, but they're all kind of connected because these are enhanced functionality which are available in the universal allocation. So what are the Fiori apps? So you have manage allocation. I think there's more than these, but there's just kind of the initial ones. Manage allocation, think of that as the equivalent of creating your allocation cycle. Remember, it doesn't matter if it's an assessment or distribution plan or actual cost center, profit center, GL, it's one app, manage allocation. That's how you create the allocation. Run allocation is like your KSU5. That's how you execute the allocation, right? And I'll hop over these two and just go to allocation results is also like your KSU5, but this is the displaying the results of the allocation. In the past, you could display the results from run allocation. You still can, but it's a separate app. Also, these apps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you can go from one app and branch into the other, right? So especially these 3, manage, run, allocation results. There's buttons at the top of the Fiori app that just show you which, when you click on it, it'll jump to the other app and show you either the results or editing or running it. And I mentioned managing statistical key figures is its own app as well as global hierarchies. So these are just These are not part of universal allocation, but they are typically used in universal allocation. So you could have an allocation that doesn't have a statistical key figure and doesn't use global accounting hierarchies, but it's very normal to have those as part of your allocations. Right, so the managed allocation app, so that's, as mentioned, is the creation of the allocation cycles and the segment. So for those, I'm pretty sure everyone on this webcast knows, but to create an allocation, you first create a cycle, which is like kind of like a high-level umbrella that says, this is what I want to allocate, like warehousing cost is a cycle. Then within the cycle, you have segments, and the segments are more specific to what your senders and receivers are and what kind of allocation it is. So it's almost like you have a wheel and you have spokes in the wheel. The cycle is the wheel, the segments are the spokes. So you can create these allocation cycles for profit center, cost center, and margin analysis. Again, for those who don't know, margin analysis is the new name for COPA. COPA, which in S/4HANA is called, what we used to call account-based COPA. That name has been phased out. So anytime you hear margin analysis, that just means COPA. Key features of the Management Allocations app. The cycles are defined with respect to ledger and company code, right? Remember in S/4HANA Universal Journal, ledger is everything, right? So you have to have a ledger and a company code. You manage them in a simplified, unified user interface. It shows you all your allocation cycles. I have a screenshot that shows that where you can edit, copy, or delete from there. It combines FI and CO allocation cycles for plan and actual. Like I said, these are not two different transactions all in one, right? It's just a drop down that says plan or actual. You can upload senders and receiver values if you don't want to use a group or enter it manually. The smooth navigation to the related application. So like I said, you can jump from the manage allocation to run allocation, or from run allocation to review to allocation results. Right, so they're all intertwined. You can analyze details of the segments, and you can lock allocation segments which was available in ECC to prevent running of that segment. That's the Managed Allocation app. You know, so here's a screenshot of the app itself. So that's standard Fiori. As most Fiori apps have, at the top it has different filtering fields. Which, if you think about it, if you filter, if we look here. Allocation context. So context is what distinguish whether it's cost center, margin analysis, or profit center. You know, I mentioned there's three types of allocation. Think of it as allocation sender objects. You can allocate from a cost center, from a profit center, or from margin analysis or COPA. So one thing to know, cost center is pretty easy. Everybody knows about cost center. Something to note about Profit Center, because when I started at SAP, Profit Center had its own types of allocation, right? Then New GL came out. Then New GL had its own type of allocation, right? You had Profit Center allocation, you have New GL allocation, which came later, the FAGL, whatever allocation. In S4, Profit Center allocation and New GL allocation is the same thing, right? Because remember, when New GL came out, Profit Center kind of became embedded in New GL. Those old Profit Center allocations you could still do, but that was if you were using classic Profit Center. The New GL and Profit Center allocation, same thing. So if you allocate Profit Center or segment, all that stuff, that's still this Profit Centers, right? So think of this as the FI type of allocation. This is the CO type of allocation, and this is COPA. Okay. So other things you have here is just, you know, description of your cycle, controlling error, company code. Allocation type, it doesn't show here. Maybe I have it on another slide. That's what it says if it's an assessment. So if you're using secondary cost allocation, or if it's a distribution. So assessment or distribution is what shows there. Actually, I want to say something about that. It's another thing I think SAP has just slipped in, and I'm not sure if I have it on the slide, so I'll say it now. In allocation type, in fact, in Universal Allocation, you barely see the word assessment. You might see it maybe on the results screen, but when it comes to the allocation type, they have distribution and they have overhead allocation. So overhead allocation is what I think probably is what assessments is now going to be called. You don't have the word assessment in the allocation text, so just FYI. Okay, so the new allocation cycle, once you've created it, it shows up as a list underneath here. And by the way, if you want to create a new allocation cycle, like in this screen, you just click on the plus and it's a new one. If you just want to change it, it's going to show as a list, and then you click on it and change it or do what you or do what you need to do or jump to run the allocation cycle. And then when you, like I said, within the cycle, you have these segments. So in the segments, just like you see in ECC, you'll have your tracing factor, which again, variable portion type is here. And then your selection criteria of your receiver. In this case, we're talking about receivers. So the selection criteria, the tabs in the universal allocation are pretty similar to what you have in assessment or distribution. So if you've used assessments or distributions, you'll be pretty comfortable with that. You can see in this case, this is a distribution because the allocation test is distribution. All right, so to run allocation, so this is a central location to perform a test or actual run for an existing cycle and then display the details of what you ran. Again, like I said, in run allocation used to be like a central allocation for running and reviewing the results, just like it is in ECC, like KSU5, you run it, you review it. But then SAP came out with a different app. But even though you can jump from one app to the other. So just look at this as a way to run and review. The good thing about the separate app is that even if you didn't run it, if you wanted to review the results of the run, you can do that whenever you want, like after you've run it, right? It doesn't have to be just when you run it that you review the results as is within ECC. So, and obviously you can reverse the run once you've done it. I mean, you can do that in ECC too. Key features, it has a more detailed business transaction type. So this BTT type is different for if it's actual plan or if it's overhead allocation, which is an assessment, or if it's a distribution. Custom fields are not yet supported. You can have cycle groups where you initiate runs for multiple cycles at once. Those cycle groups, by the way, actually created with a global accounting hierarchy app, right? So that app, like I said, you can create cost center, cost element, profit center groups, financial statement version, anything that's a group or a set, you can create with that. And if you're grouping cycles together, that's also a group, and you create it with global accounting hierarchies. Analyze your allocation results and view the sender and receiver values. You can perform test runs for specified period. You can display a detailed view. I think I have something showing that. And you can navigate directly to Manage Allocations app and also to the Allocation Results app. You can do reversals. And when you have these allocation in your run allocation, when you have it in the list, you have different cycles in the list. Normally what happens, the sequence of execution of those cycles is in accordance with its kind of ranking in the list. You can drag and drop the cycles if you want to change the order of the sequence, right? So the run application, this just shows the Fiori app that shows, actually this one actually shows the allocation results, but what I want to show here is just the look and feel is it's all very kind of similar, right? In this case, we are in the run allocation app, but we're viewing the results. We can show the senders and receivers. So it's just a button here. You click on it. It shows you the account number, cost center, profit center, segment, and the amounts. And again, with this, I mentioned, cost center. I mentioned profit centers being merged with the general ledger allocation in ECC, actually in ECC and now in S4 as well. If it's a cost center allocation and the cost center is assigned to a profit center and the profit center is assigned to a segment, your allocation results will show all the downstream objects that the cost center is assigned to. So like I said, I mean, this is a cost center allocation, but you're going to see everything, just as you do in the Universal Journal, where it shows you all the details that fill the fields of the Universal Journal will be populated if they can be, right? So you'll get that granular view from a cost center, profit center, segment, functional area, and whatever else the cost center is assigned to. So the Allocation Results app shows the allocation run results. It helps you understand questions like who's allocating which costs to the product, what tracing factor is used, which cost elements are used, what does the cost flow look like. Again, today in ECC, you can see that, but you have to go through several screens, several clicks. You may not even know where you're going. You may get lost, as a number of people do with these allocations, but it's just so much easier to navigate with Universal Allocation. Yeah, and then who's allocating the cost? If you're a budget owner or cost center owner, who's allocating the cost to me, right? What is the tracing factor being used? On what basis is that tracing factor being used? If it's a statistical key figure, is it head count, is it square footage? All that stuff was so much more difficult to do in ECC unless you're jumping to either literally go to another transaction or somehow figure out, maybe by double clicking on the field, you figure out in order to get the information you want. You also have the where used list. Now, this is one I wanted to show if we have the demo, because I think this is pretty cool. And I don't think it's an ECC, which is where in the Universal Allocation app, you can click on a specific cost center, click on this where used list, and it shows you all the different allocations that the cost center is used in, right? Which is, I think, that would take so long to do if you were an ACC, because I don't think you don't have a where used list for allocation. If you did, it would be like an allocation for assessment alone, or distribution alone, or top down alone. It wouldn't say, just show me everything. Just show me anywhere that allocations are being used with this cost object. Right, so here's a little graph of the allocation results. So this is the Allocation Results app, which shows you what is being allocated. So in this case, you have your cycle A001, all the segments underneath the cycle. What kind of allocation type is it? So remember, it could be a cost center, an overhead allocation, or a distribution. And then you have this graph, which I'll go into. I'll show a little bit later, which is a little newer because it's almost a graphical representation of cost center sender to cost center receiver and how it spreads the cost. A visual representation, which you can drill into if you want to see more data. So that's an example here. You have these senders on this side, receivers on that side. The arrows show you where the sender cost is being spread and how much has been spread to the receiver. Now, it doesn't specifically tell you if you don't click on it, because if other costs are going into that receiving cost center, it's just going to show how much was allocated there, right? But it shows you here how much was allocated from, how much was allocated to, and if you click on that cost center, on that cycle, then it'll show you all the cost centers involved, how much exactly was going, how much was in there. Same thing for receivers. So these boxes I think are pretty good. I know there's something similar to this in ECC, but I see more for project systems. I don't necessarily see it for allocations, but it's just a nice visual graph that shows that to you. So another cool thing about Universal Allocation is just the intuitive way you can get from your cost center or a cost center you're querying to where it's going, how much went from one place to the other, what tracing factor was used, and a lot of other things. So this is another view of this, and it shows the sending cost centers. Like in this case, you have like multiple layers, right? You have a sending cost center, which two cost centers converging in one, and that one cost center is spreading out. And you're just having, and then the amounts as well, and the currencies, I think very powerful when you think about, especially for companies, and I've worked with several of them that have a very labyrinthian allocation structure, and you just can't figure out what's going from where to where. All right. See if there's anything else here. I mean, I think one other good thing about this, which I think for those of you who haven't used it yet, or maybe some of you haven't used Fiori yet, is I find that with Fiori, just generally, it seems navigating it seems more natural than navigating the GUI. Maybe because we're all in the internet age, and like if you go to a new website or something, you don't need a user guide to navigate the website, right? And if you're in ECC and you have a new transaction, right, you almost need like a BPP, a document to tell you how to get through it, because it's not as user friendly. But with Fiori, maybe it's because we're so accustomed to using the internet. I noticed that when a new app comes out and I go into the app and try to figure it out, it's so easy, right? It just drop downs, clicks. There's nothing outside the norm of how you would normally use an internet app. And I think you'll find that even if you've never used this app before, right? So this was the screen I was mentioning of the where used. So you enter a cost center, and it tells you where is it being used. So this is the cost center here, right? It tells you these are all the cycles that it's used in. These are all the segments in the cycles it's used in. These are all the allocation types. Remember, allocation type, overhead allocation means assessment, right? So it's been used in assessment. Is it a sender or receiver, right? What is the sender role? So is it fixed amounts? Is a fixed amount meaning is it just only the fixed, a specific amount in that cost center? Is it posted amounts? Is it everything in there? And what's the receiver role if it's a receiver? So a lot of good information, as you can see, just on one screen, as opposed to branching into so many different things. So this where used list, you can have it for cost centers, statistical key figures, activity types, and profit centers. So a lot of cool functionality, a lot of functionality, very easy to navigate, and like I said, still a work in progress, because I just generally with the universal allocation, there are some gaps I have noticed. I'm trying to think of for example, although you can allocate cost center, profit center, and margin analysis, COPA, I haven't seen cost center to COPA allocation in Universal Allocation. I think that's maybe in a future release. It's not in 1909. I don't even think it's in S4 2020. For those of you who don't know, S4 HANA 2020 is the latest release that came out last week or 2 weeks ago, right? So it's not 2009, it's just called 2020. And it's not in 2020, so maybe in 2021. But so KEU1, KEU5, cost center to COPA. I haven't seen it. You know, if anyone's seen it, maybe let me know. Send us a message about that. Other things, I think I haven't seen allocation structures. Allocation structures was an easier way to align your sender cost elements and your receiver cost elements in ACC, which is available in ACC. I haven't seen that, right? So you actually need to specify your sender and receiver cost elements. Not everybody uses allocation structures, but I haven't seen that. So that's another thing. So still, like I said, still some things that SAP will hopefully come out with. Now, statistical key figures, I mentioned that this is separate from Universal Allocation. It's a separate app, but it is part of the Universal Allocation if you're using statistical key figures as a tracing factor, right? So it allows you to perform planning in an external system. So you can plan in Excel, you can plan your statistical key figures. So what does that mean? If your statistical key figure is number of employees in a department, right? or if it's square footage or whatever, you can enter that in a plan in Microsoft Excel, easily upload it into this statistical key figure app, right? Do a validation check before you do the upload, and then upload and analyze the data. And so again, that's an app, and it's very easy for those who don't know, or who don't readily use Fiori. It's very easy to find. If you go to the Fiori app library, search on Google, go into the library and type in whatever you want, like statistical key figures, and you'll see the app, you'll see what it does, and whatever other information you want to know about it. Okay. And then I mentioned managing global accounting hierarchies. Again, this is a new app. It's not strictly embedded with Universal Allocation, but Universal Allocation uses data that's created or managed with global accounting hierarchies, and you can branch from Universal Allocation to global accounting hierarchies. So global accounting hierarchies allows you, I mentioned, to create cost center, profit center, cost element groups. So anything that's a hierarchy, you can do it here. Not anything, but a lot of things. And I'm pretty sure it's a growing list. A lot of management of hierarchies is done in global accounting hierarchies and is used in Universal Allocation, because you may not want to put each individual, or you may not want to have a segment for each cost center or profit center. You may just want to have a cost center group, and which is managed or chained in this accounting hierarchy. Also, you may want to manage your allocation cycles as groups, and if you do, you also use global accounting hierarchies for that. So they provide a unified way for maintaining different objects like cost center, profit center, functional area, financial statement version. You can do your create, edit. You can use multiple time frames, which is something that in ECC, one thing lacking from hierarchies in ECC, for most hierarchies, is a time dependency, right? If you're changing your financial statement version, a cost center, a profit center group, you just change it. You might have a change history, but really you don't have any like, hey, this group is valid till this date, but then I want to change a few things, or it's going to be restructured at a certain point in the future. That is available within managing global hierarchies, and I think that's pretty powerful. And then also the export, and anyone who's used hierarchies or groups in ECC know it's a pain to export, and forget about importing. That's even harder. But it's a pain to export to spreadsheets in a nice, usable, and readable format. Then you can define semantic tags. Semantic tags is something new that came out with 1809, I believe, which just gives you a better way to quickly create hierarchies and not reinvent the wheel, because you've tagged all. They're almost like financial statement version nodes. Like you've tagged these different groups of objects, and you can just use those tags to create a new group as opposed to building from scratch. And also the financial statement version, I mentioned that's another group that you can manage with that. So here's just a screen. In fact, in this one, I think is banks that I have shown here, but the logic is the same for a lot of, almost anything that you can put in a group in FI or CO is managed through this global accounting hierarchies. Okay, so that was hopefully a run through of universal allocations, the different. I mentioned the three main areas as manage, run, and allocation results as 3 apps versus 120 apps in ECC. The connected apps such as statistical key figures and global accounting hierarchies. Like I said, this is something that it's totally connected with the Universal Journal. So all the granularity and universality of the Universal Journal is embedded in the universal allocation. And one thing I'd say is, just don't totally abandon your old allocations yet. Wait until, just wait until you've really researched and maybe explored the functionality and features of it. Make sure you're satisfied before you totally abandon the old ones, because there are some things still missing, but hopefully on the roadmap. So I'm going to hand over to Jess, because I think we have a few questions in. So for the next 10 minutes, I'll try to answer as many as I can. And just so you know, if you've attended any of these webcasts, we answer all the questions. So when we're going to send a email to everyone who's registered with all the questions that were asked, and we'll provide answers. If we haven't provided it now, we will before we send that out. So over to you, Jess.
All right, awesome. Thanks for a wonderful presentation, Paul. So a couple questions we have here. The first question is, can you perform top-down distribution for plan data?
Yes. So top-down distribution, like I said, is where you allocate data from a higher level characteristic, COPA or margin analysis characteristic, like plant, to a lower level like product. It's typically for actual data using KE28. Plan data is with a transaction called KE1G. So in ECC, you go to KE1G, you can top-down distribute for plan data. But however, with the universal allocation, that's another limitation. Plan data, they don't have top-down distribution for plan data. They only have actual. I'm pretty sure it's on the roadmap. It wouldn't make sense for it not to be. But so in ECC, it's KE1G. In S/4HANA, it exists. It doesn't exist yet, but it does for plan.
So next question is, can you allocate values from the extension ledger?
So the extension ledger is this kind of alternative ledger that came out with S/4HANA, I think 17, maybe 1610. It does several things, right? Extension ledger is, you can use it to simulate, you can use it for foreign currency, you can use it for predictive accounting. And if you remember, I said that the universal allocation, the key field is ledger, right? So you're doing your allocations by ledger, then you've company code and cost object, but ledger is a key field. So just as you can allocate your leading ledger, you can also allocate your extension ledger. And it kind of, I don't want to use the term valid, but it goes against something I've always had indoctrinated since I started SAP, which is if something's statistical or something is not real, you can't further allocate it. But that's no longer the case, right? Because with universal allocation, actually with universal journal generally, it's just blown a lot of that CO type, that CO logic that a lot of us have come accustomed to. It blows it out of the water because it does a lot of things differently. You can actually allocate statistical objects. You can do a lot of that stuff. So extension, when I mentioned that you can use universal allocation to simulate what would happen if, let's say, you merged or you did your results were totally different from what they are, you could use the extension ledger for that, and you could use allocation for that.
So third question is, did the allocations that already exist in ECC get automatically transferred to Universal Allocations and S/4HANA?
Yes. So the allocations in ECC, when you go to Fiori, there's a Fiori app, manage universal allocation, it should automatically come up with all the allocations that you have in ECC. Now, I say that, but there might be some limitations. I think there's still some limitations with universal allocation. There's still some things that ECC has that it doesn't have. But for the most part, you should see a list of your current allocations which you can build on.
So there's enough time for a couple more questions, so I will just address these last two. What are the upcoming functionality upgrades to manage and execute universal allocations through automated processes?
The functionality upgrades, well, a lot of it is what I have mentioned. So one upgrade is you have multiple allocation types and multiple allocation type being assessment distribution, top-down distribution, and allocation context, meaning cost center, profit center, COPA, all merged in one, right? So you have a one-stop shop for things that were in totally different places, right? You have the usability of Fiori. Like I said, I think it's anybody can go into Universal Allocation and figure it out. You don't necessarily, well, you should have a guide anyway, but you don't necessarily need one because it's very user-friendly. What you need to do on that screen. So you have that. You have some notifications as well. So if you have, I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called something framework. You have some notifications if you ran an allocation, right? If you run an allocation and it's running and you get a warning or error message in your Fiori app, you actually get something like a text message, a message on your Fiori that pops up and says, oh, you have this number of warnings. So you get this kind of real-time pop-up warnings or error message if something happens to the allocation. So you have that, and then you have, just the navigation. I think that the key thing is the harmonization of all these different processes and the ability to navigate easily from one place to the other without having to go through so many clicks.
So last question, will we be able to upload and download information between SAP and Excel or have other functionality to eliminate or greatly reduce our current manual processes?
So the answer to Excel is for the sender and receiver objects, yes. Sender and receiver objects like your cost centers and profit centers, all that, instead of manually typing it in or using a cost center or profit center group, you could actually just have an Excel upload. There's a button on the Manage Allocations app that you can just upload from Excel. So you can upload senders and receivers. I'm not sure you can there might be other things you can upload and download, and statistical key figures as well. You know, when you're managing statistical key figures, you can upload that from Excel. Those are the three I definitely know. There might be others, and if there are, we'll put that in the answers that we send out. But definitely senders, receivers, and statistical key figures.
So I have a couple more that have popped up. I think we have time for just one more. And this one is there a plan to integrate universal allocation with an SAP environment, not only Fiori?
That's a good question. So to answer that question, I don't know. I don't know what's in SAP's roadmap. I know only as much as I've heard and I've read and I've in some cases seen. What I would say is that it seems like the general direction of SAP user interface is going towards Fiori, right? For a good reason, right? I like the GUI as much as anyone else, but Fiori is more user-friendly. And Fiori is easier to introduce to people who've never used SAP, right? Think about anybody whenever it was, they used SAP the first time. Tell me if you could just sit down in front of your computer and just start using it without any instruction, or even if you had instruction, but Fiori is so much easier, right? I think the learning curve is much flatter for Fiori. And I think that's the reason why SAP is investing more in Fiori for new functionality like Universal Allocation and managing global hierarchies and other things than going back into ECC. So I think the answer is no to that. I think it's going to be in Fiori. It's going to stay in Fiori. All the enhancements are going to be in Fiori. And I think that makes sense. Having said that, I've incorrectly predicted things that SAP, they sometimes do a U-turn, and that could be the case. But right now, the trend is definitely towards Fiori.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thanks for presenting with us again today. Just for those of you who are still logged on, as a reminder, we will be posting this session on our website sometime next week. So please keep an eye out at ERPfixers.com. As well as those of you, I noticed that y'all posted some last minute questions in the Q&A box. I have recorded those, and Paul will be answering those, and we'll have those posted on our website as well. So just keep an eye out, www.ERPfixers.com. Thank you so much, Paul. Everybody that has joined us today, we hope you gathered enough information and have a wonderful week.